This is an audio recording of The Story of the Great Lakes by Edward Channing and Marion Florence Lansing, narrated by Right Here Audio. Part 1, Discovery and Exploration. Chapter 1, The Great Lakes. Standing in Lake Park, Chicago, beside the statue of General Logan, the supporter of Douglas and later of Lincoln, one has behind him the most marvelous city of modern times, and before him the southwesternmost of the Great Lakes. In front glitter the waters over which La Salle journeyed 3 centuries ago, and in those days they responded to the play of wind and weather, now calm as a sheet of glass, and now swept by sudden gales into turbulent waves and breakers. But the aspect of the land is such that were La Salle to visit if he would not recognize the spot. In place of a wilderness with an occasional group of low-lying Indian wigwams, he would see a mighty city of buildings towering 150 feet above the street and reaching down from 25 to 50 feet below ground. In place of a few canoes, were there loads of fur and crews of savages emerging from the narrow mouth of the Chicago River. 7,000 freighters and steamers, with an aggregate tonnage greater than that floated in any other port in the world, touch annually at the wharves along her splendid harbor front. These vessels, and thousands of trains running on tracks whose mileage is more than a third of that of the whole railway system of the United States, bring to her stockyards, her grain elevators, and her markets the herds and flocks of the western plains, the crops of the wheat fields of the Northwest, and the merchandise of Europe and Asia. Chicago is the greatest distributing center of this region, but the ports of Lake Erie handle many important industries whose traffic never enters Lake Michigan. The copper of the upper Michigan Peninsula, the iron ore of the Wisconsin and Minnesota ranges, the coal of Ohio and Pennsylvania, and many a minor industry have had their share in building up the modern empire of the Great Lakes. The body of water about which this empire has risen is made up of 5 lakes: Superior, Huron, Michigan, Erie, and Ontario, which together form the greatest inland waterway of the world. These lakes have an area of more than half that of the Black Sea or the Caspian, while Lake Superior is the largest body of freshwater on the globe. The 4 upper lakes are so nearly level that one canal with a single lock has given them a navigatable length of over 1,400 miles. Lake Ontario, however, is effectively separated from the others by Niagara Falls and its attendant rapids. Other great inland bodies of water are directly connected with the ocean by navigable straits. The Mediterranean Sea is entered from the Atlantic by the Strait of Gibraltar. The Black Sea is connected in its turn with the Mediterranean by the Dardanelles and the Bosphorus, but Niagara closes direct navigation between the Great Lakes and the sea. Canals have done much in the last 100 years to alleviate the natural inaccessibility of the lake system. 85 years ago, the Erie Canal gave a water route from the eastern end of Lake Erie to the Hudson River and thus to the Atlantic Ocean. 5 years later, the Welland Canal passed round Niagara Falls and connected Lake Erie with Lake Ontario, and a third canal soon connected Lake Erie with the Ohio River. Today, a second era of canal buildings is upon us. The Welland Canal has been widened, making it possible for boats of moderate draught to go from Lake Erie to Lake Ontario, and thence by numerous small cuts around the rapids of the St. Lawrence to the Atlantic. The Erie Canal is being enlarged, and engineers dream of a time when it will be made sufficiently wide and deep for seagoing vessels to pass from the Atlantic Ocean to Lake Erie. The Hennepin Canal at Chicago will open a route from Lake Michigan by the Illinois and Mississippi rivers into the Gulf of Mexico. Each state bordering on the Great Lakes, as well as every province of the Dominion of Canada, is today planning extensions of this canal system. On the lonely shores past which La Salle and later explorers voyaged have been built villages, towns, and cities. This region is today the clearinghouse of the commerce of the central plain of North America. From the western terminals of the lake routes, railways pass over the plains and mountains of the Northwest to the Pacific. From their eastern ports stretch lines to the seaboard cities of the Atlantic. The farms of the Northwest send yearly 150 million bushels of wheat, 600 million bushels of oats, and 1 billion bushels of corn to Chicago and Buffalo, and thence to the eastern states and Europe. Coming from the west, the transcontinental roads pay tribute at Chicago and then choose between the route north of Lake Erie via Detroit or south via Cleveland. They untie at Buffalo and follow the Mohawk Valley to the Hudson and then to New York or Boston. Or they pass the Alleghenies farther south and reach the coast at Philadelphia, Baltimore, or Norfolk. In any case, by land of water from the north or from the west, these products come to the Great Lakes and are carried from their ports to the factories and markets of the east, or to steamers bound for Europe. This combination of land and water transportation makes the Great Lakes the keystone of American industry. We have spoken of the four upper lakes as united commercially into one great sea. Before Lake Superior could be entered from the others, one formidable obstacle had to be overcome. Between Lake Superior and Lake Huron was a ledge of rocks half a mile long over which the waters ran in swirling rapids, forming the Sault, or Rapids, of Ste. Marie. At this point, the famous Sioux Canal has been constructed with a single lock, which is the largest and costliest in the world, though it will soon be surpassed by those at the entrance of the Panama Canal. This canal was built in 1855 when the presence of iron and copper deposits in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota was first discovered. Today, the tonnage passing yearly through it runs up into figures that are almost beyond belief, but these figures form the best single index of the traffic of the Great Lakes. In the 7 open months of 1907, there passed through the Sioux 100 million tons of freight valued at $450 million. This tonnage is 9 times that of Suez Canal. The mines whose discovery made necessary the cutting of the Sioux Canal supply a large part of this freight. Of iron ore, they sent 33 million tons to the foundries and furnaces of Pittsburgh and other centers, where the raw material is manufactured into articles of iron and steel which form the basis of modern civilized existence. From the deposits of the upper Michigan Peninsula comes yearly 1/7 of the world's supply of copper. These figures give some idea of the importance of the Great Lakes in the economic development of the United States. 300 years have seen this region converted from a wilderness peopled by Indian tribes to the uses of modern civilization. This time might well be shortened since at the beginning of the 19th century the Great Lakes and bordering lands were still occupied by the red man and a few small villages and trading stations of the whites. It is indeed wonderful what changes a century has witnessed. Chapter 2. Champlain on the Great Lakes. On the 28th of July, 1615, Samuel de Champlain paddled out of the mouth of the French River into the waters of Georgian Bay, an arm of Lake Huron, or as he named it from its great expanse, the Mer Douce, or freshwater sea. With him was a young interpreter, Etienne Brulé, who had been sent by Champlain when a mere lad to winter in the Huron country, and to learn from the Indians their languages and customs. As a member of this Huron party, in 1610, he had been the first white man to look upon the waters of Lake Huron, the central of the 5 Great Lakes. Now Champlain himself had come journeying from Montreal with a trading party of Indians. Some of the Indians had slipped away before the rest of the expedition was ready, taking with them a missionary. Father Joseph Le Caron had, therefore, made the journey a few days before his leader, but at least Champlain had reached the marvelous sea of Indian story, and was on the point of exploring the region of the Great Lakes. He found the lands bordering the lakes occupied by 3 groups of Indians: the Iroquois, who were closely banded together into a league known as the 5 Nations, the Hurons, who were related to them but were always at war with them, and the Algonquins, who belonged to one great family but were now divided into many widely scattered and independent tribes. The 5 nations of the Iroquois were joined in a loose but effective confederacy. Originally, they had formed one great tribe, but internal dissension had split them into 5: the Mohawks, Oneidas, Onondagas, Cayugas, and Senecas. Legend states that Hiawatha had counseled union and had thus brought about the League of the Iroquois, which was the most important Indian organization north of Mexico. The confederation was governed by 50 sachems, 10 from each nation, who made up a grand council. Unanimity was required in all decisions, but when these were once arrived at, the tribes were obedient. The Iroquois lived in a wide strip of country extending from Lake Erie and Lake Ontario eastward across central New York. They called this section of country the Longhouse, from its resemblance in shape to one of their oblong dwellings. The Algonquins occupied the greater part of the country from the St. Lawrence to Lake Superior and the Mississippi, and included the Illinois, Wisconsin, Chippewa, Ottawa, and other tribes of the lake region. In the center of the Algonquin country, in a narrow district extending eastward from Georgian Bay towards Lake Ontario, lived the Huron Nation, a strong and prosperous tribe. Between them and the Iroquois, there was constant enmity. And for a time, after the coming of the whites, it was by no means certain which group of Indians would come out victorious. It was while this contest was at its height that Samuel de Champlain came to the St. Lawrence and in 1608 founded Quebec. It was to the Huron settlements he was journeying in the summer of 1615. Champlain was born in southern France and had already won fame as an explorer. He had visited the West Indies, Mexico, and Central America, and suggested the building of a ship canal at Panama. He had coasted the shores of New England and had been one of the first French colonists at the Bay of Fundy. After the founding of Quebec, he had traversed the lake which now bears his name and had journeyed far and wide in the surrounding region. In these expeditions, he had allied himself with the Indians of the St. Lawrence and had supported them in their battles with the Iroquois. In the summer of 1615, yielding to the clamors of the Hurons gathered at Montreal for their yearly traffic with the French, Champlain agreed to accompany them on an inroad into the Iroquois country. He departed for Quebec to make needful preparations, and when he returned after a delay of the few days, he found that the impatient Indians had set out for the villages, taking with them Father Joseph Le Caron, a Recollect friar, who had come out with him from France that spring as a missionary to the Indians. Champlain embarked immediately with 10 natives, Brulé, and another Frenchman on the journey to the Huron villages. He approached Lake Huron by the hard northern route, traveling up the Ottawa along the portage path to Lake Nipissing, across which he sailed and down the French River. Indian tribes along the way encouraged the voyagers, telling them that the Lake of the Hurons was at hand. At length, they came out from between the banks of the river into the waters of the lake. For more than 100 miles, they coasted southward along its eastern shores, working their way in and out among countless islands till they reached the lower end of Georgian Bay. There, they landed and proceeded by a well-beaten trail into the heart of the Huron County. From the moment when he entered the first Huron village, Champlain recognized that this was an Indian community different from any that he had heretofore seen. He had come upon one of the most remarkable savage settlements on the continent. The people lived in permanent villages, protected by palisades of crossed and intersecting trunk of trees. Not only was the land naturally fertile, but in the clearings between the stretches of heavy forests were cultivated fields of maize and pumpkins, and gay patches of sunflowers from the seeds of which the Indians made oil for their hair. To Champlain, coming from the roving Algonquins of the St. Lawrence and the barren country along the Ottawa, where the Indian population lived by hunting and fishing, the social advancement of this group of tribes seemed very great. The Hurons welcomed him with eager hospitality and took him from village to village, entertaining him with lavish feasting and celebration, for he was the champion who was to lead them to victory against their hated foe, the Iroquois. At the principal Huron village, Caragua, a settlement of 200 bark lodges enclosed in a palisade 30 feet high, Champlain found Father Le Caron. The priest had feared that his leader would not follow the Hurons, or that if he did, he would be captured by the Iroquois. When he looked up one morning and saw Champlain standing in the doorway of his dwelling, his joy knew no bounds. He showed him the bark wigwam which the Indians, to prove the joy that they felt at his coming, were building for him. They had offered at first to lodge him in one of their common cabins, but Father Le Caron had remonstrated with them, representing that to negotiate with God affairs so important involving the salvation of their whole nation, he needed a place where he could be alone, far from the tumult of their families. So they had brought poles and bark and erected this lodge at the edge of the forest. Here he had raised an altar, and here on the 12th of August was celebrated the first Mass ever held in the country of the Hurons. Curious Indians crowded around as the priest stood before his rude altar and led the devotions of the kneeling band of Frenchmen with Champlain at their head. For the first time the solemn chant of the Ditum Lendemains rang out on the listening air, and a volley of muskets proclaimed the planting of a cross outside the priest's lodge. The symbol of Christianity had been raised in the country of the heathens. Before they set out on the warpath, the Huron chiefs insisted on a weary succession of feasting and dancing, rejoicing in their serene conviction of victory to come. Champlain spent the time going from village to village, gratifying his insatiable curiosity over everything which he saw. At last, the savage war party was ready to set out. They crossed Lake Simcoe and paddled, making the necessary portages down the chain of intervening lakes to the River Trent, which flowed into Lake Ottawa. The country through which the long line of canoes passed was singularly beautiful. Champlain found it hard to believe that the groves of walnut trees, whose branches were twined with hanging grapevines, had not been set out by the hand of man to form a beautiful artistic picture. The party stopped once and encamped for a grand deer hunt, and then proceeded on its way, well stocked with provisions for the first days in the enemy's country. Out upon Lake Ontario, the frail canoes ventured and crossed it in safety, landing on the eastern side of the lake 30 miles or so from Oswego. Now a change came over the warriors. Silently they hid their canoes in the woods, and with stealthy and rapid steps they filed in silence through the borders of this hostile country. For 4 days they marched inland through the forest, crossing the Oneida River at the western end of the lake, and on the 9th of October some of their scouts brought in a captured fishing party of 11 Iroquois men, women, and children. A Huron chief took possession of the prisoners and began to torture them, cutting off a finger of one of the women. Champlain met this method of celebration with angry protest, declaring that it was not the act of a warrior to treat helpless women with cruelty, since it was displeasing to Champlain to do nothing more to the women, but added that he would do to the men what he pleased. It was a curious position in which Champlain had placed himself, aiding one group of savages against another, nor did he find it to his liking. The next day the war party came out into a clearing in the forest from which they could see the Iroquois fort. A number of Iroquois were gathered corn and pumpkins in the adjoining field. With a rush of impetuous young Hurons who were in advance, screamed their war cry and fell upon them. The Iroquois seized their arms and defended themselves with such success that their assailants began to fall back. Only the timely aid of Champlain and the Frenchmen, with their terrifying muskets, saved the invaders from defeat. Champlain saw this irregular way of fighting each person according to his whim would result in utter ruin. The Hurons withdrew into the forest to encamp for the night, and there he addressed them angrily, showing them their foolishness and instructing them in the best methods of war. He found the Iroquois' village to be far more strongly defended than any he had seen among the Indians. 4 rows of palisades made of trees 30 feet high supported a kind of gallery, which was provided with wooden gutters for quenching fire and piled high with a goodly supply of stones to hurl at the enemy. This was a stronghold that could not be captured by the haphazard methods of the Hurons. Champlain sent the Indians to work the next morning, building a wooden tower high enough to overlook the palisades and large enough to shelter 4 or 5 marksmen. In 4 hours the work was done, and 200 of the strongest warriors dragged it forward to a position from which the musketeers could pour a deadly fire into the crowded galleries. The rank and file of the Hurons were meanwhile equipped with huge wooden shields to protect themselves against the arrows and stones of the enemy. As the deadly bullets fell among the Iroquois, rushed headlong from the gallery, and the result of the battle would have been very different had the Hurons followed out Champlain's well-conceived plans, but they were ungovernable. With reckless fury they threw away their shields, and yelling their war cry so shrilly that no command could be heard, they poured out into the open field, discharging their own arrows, but exposing themselves meanwhile to a rain of stones and arrows from the Iroquois. One Huron, bolder than the rest, ran forward with firebrands to burn the palisade, and others followed him with the dry wood which they had gathered for the purpose, but they set the fire on the leeward side of the fort, where the wind was against it, and torrents of water poured down from above soon put it out. In vain, Champlain shouted commands and made every effort to restore order. He soon decided that his shouting would only burst his own head and have no effect on anyone else, so he and his Frenchmen set to work picking the Iroquois off the rampart with their shots. After 3 hours of this kind of fighting, the Hurons fell back. Only 18 men had been wounded, but among them were 2 chiefs and Champlain himself. He had received 1 arrow in the knee and another in the leg. He urged the Indians to renew the attack, but they refused. From extreme overconfidence, the warriors had passed the deepest discouragement. The next day, a violent wind offered them an opportunity to set fire to the fort, but the Hurons sat silent in their camp. For 5 days they waited to see if the 500 allies which Brulé and 12 Hurons had stated a month ago to fetch would appear. During this time they ventured out occasionally from imprudent skirmishes, each time running back under the cover of the French musket fire, amid taunts from the Iroquois on the palisade that the Hurons had very little courage to require French assistance. Then they hastily began to retreat, carrying their wounded in the center while the Iroquois harassed the flanks and rear of the company. The wounded Champlain among them were packed in rude baskets made on the spot and bound on the backs of stout warriors. Champlain gives a vivid picture of the suffering he endured while he was thus bundled in a heap and doubled and strapped together in such a fashion that it was impossible to move as for an infant in swaddling clothes. The torment from the cramped position and constantly jolting was so much worse than even the pain of his wound that as soon as he could possibly bear his weight on his legs, he got out of this prison. Snow and hail overtook the party on their dismal march to the lake. They were relieved to find their hidden canoes safe and embarked once more on Lake Ontario. In his vain effort to get the Indians to renew the attack after their first defeat, Champlain had come to see that he had lost some of his peculiar influence over them. They had fancied that his presence would ensure victory. Now they saw him wounded and by Indian weapons. Their superstitious reverence for the man with the iron breast was weakened. Here, on the shores of Lake Ontario, he was to experience a very practical consequence of his loss of prestige. The Hurons had promised him an escort to Quebec, but each warrior found a reason why he should not be able to lend his canoe for the journey. The chiefs, who had made the promise, had little control over their men, and Champlain found that he must winter with the natives. The great war party broke up. Some went to hunt deer and bears, others to trap beavers, others to fish in the frozen lakes and streams, and still others returned to their villages. One of the chiefs offered Champlain the shelter of his cabin, which he was glad to accept, and he settled down to get what comfort and information he could from his forced visit. 50 pages of Champlain's minute and wonderfully illustrated account testify to the fact that he was not idle during the winter months. He records many interesting customs of his Indian hosts. He watched their deer hunts, visited their villages, and those of neighboring tribes, was umpire in their dispute, and at last turned his face homeward in the early spring. With him went Darental, his Huron host. At Quebec, Champlain was welcomed as one risen from the dead, for the Indians had long since brought in word that he had been killed. A solemn service was held, and all untied and rendering thanks to God for protecting the travelers in their many perils and dangers. Upon this service and the various acts of welcome, Darental gazed in bewilderment, astonishment. Champlain showed him all the marvelous details of civilization. With the usual Indian stolidity, he observed everything carefully and calmly, but at last his wonder broke down his reserve. Before he departed, he told Champlain that he should never die contented until he had told his friends of the French way of living and seen them adopt it. With valuable presents and a warm invitation to come again with some of his friends, Darental paddled back to his lodge in the woods with a story that must have taken months in the telling. This was Champlain's last long trip of exploration. The remaining years of his life, he needs of the colony at Quebec held him fast. His writings, sold in the bookstalls of France, inspired others to cross the seas and to continue the exploration and settlement of the wilderness. Chapter 3. The Jesuit Mission to the Hurons. From 1615, when Father Joseph Le Caron celebrated the first Mass amongst the Hurons, for 14 years, a few intrepid priests braved the difficulties of savage life and endeavors at various times to set up missions in the popular Huron villages south of Georgian Bay. They suffered almost incredible hardship, and in 1629, Jean Brebeuf was the only one who was left in the region. He was recalled to Quebec, but 5 years later, a year before Champlain's death, he set out with 2 Jesuit companions to found in the villages where Champlain had wintered 18 years before, the greatest Jesuit mission in the history of New France. No man in the annals of church history had shown greater personal heroism than Father Jean Brebeuf. He was tall and strong, well fitted to withstand the hardship of his chosen calling and to impress the Indians with his power. The square cap and surplice which he donned when he assembled them for instruction in order, as he naively writes, to give more majesty to his appearance, were never less needed. With natural dignity he combined the power of a life consecrated with the utmost favour of God and his church. Never during long years of service did he waver in his devotion nor shrink from anything that lay before him in his work. From his reports sent home to his superiors, it is evident that he made a deep impression on the Indians. In these detailed accounts from his experience and of the savages among whom he worked, we get a clear idea of the man. We see him on the long canoe journeys, sharing in the labor of paddling and portages, till even he, who already knew, as he says, a little what it is to be fatigued, was so weary that his body could do no more. But he tells us how at these very times his soul experienced a deep peace, such as it had never known before. In the most matter-of-fact way, he accepts and records the continual hardships, never complaining of his lot, but writing with rare modesty because his whole attention is centered on the work instead of on himself. From his vivid pictures we learn, however, the truth of one of his casual statements. Truly, he says, to come here much strength and patience are needed, and he who thinks of coming here for any other than God will have made a sad mistake. In 1634, Father Brebeuf and his companions started on the northern journey by the Ottawa River and Lake Nipissing to the Huron country. They accompanied a party of Hurons who were returning from their annual summer trading visit to Quebec. This 900-mile trip took 30 days. Brebeuf kept count and found that they carried their canoes 35 times on portages, 1, 2, and even 3 leagues long, covering the distance 3 and 4 times to transport even their small amount of baggage, and that they dragged the canoes through rapids at least 50 times, plunging into the icy water and cutting their feet on the rocky bottom. At night they slept on the bare earth on hard rocks, stung by clouds of mosquitoes. Their only food was a small portion of Indian corn coarsely broken between 2 stones, which, though better than fasting, was regarded by the Jesuits as no great treat. Yet denying themselves the ordinary necessities of life, these priests transported the precious vessel for the Mass over all this weary way. The other Jesuits suffered even more than Brebeuf. Their goods were stolen, they were separated from the rest of the Huron party, and deserted midway in the journey. It was weeks before the worn-out travelers rejoined their superior in the Huron village. After a few experiences like this in reaching the mission, these wise priests composed a set of instructions to the brethren who should follow them on this Ottawa route. This code of behavior is highly characteristic of the methods of the French Jesuits in every detail, from not keeping the Indians waiting when they were ready to embark and not asking too many questions, to being careful that in the canoe the brim of the priest's hat did not annoy those who sat near him. These Jesuit fathers aimed not to be troublesome, even to a single Indian, and to love them like brothers with whom you are to spend the rest of your life. In this spirit lay the success of all French effort among these savage peoples. At length Brebeuf landed on the southern shores of Georgian Bay, only to be deserted at the last moment by his Huron guides and left standing in the midst of his baggage on the lonely shore. He knew the place well, for he had lived 3 years in a neighboring village. This settlement had, however, been destroyed, and its inhabitants had built their huts on another spot several miles away. Brebeuf hid his goods in the woods and set out alone by one of the gloomy forest paths, which brought him, to his great relief, to the new village. At sight of him, someone cried out, "Why, there is a combe come again!" And at once everyone ran out to salute and welcome him, calling, "What a combe, my nephew, my brother, my cousin, hast thou come again?" His goods were fetched from the shore, and Brebeuf was established in the house of a leading chief. As soon as his brother priests had arrived, the Indians set about building a house for the Jesuits. Bad crops and famine had afflicted the people of late, and they rejoiced doubly at the coming of Brebeuf, feeling sure that now the crops would no longer fail. They wished, therefore, to provide for him staying in their village instead of that of their neighbors. The house which the missionaries had built for them was a constant wonder to the Indians. It was 36 feet long and 20 wide, and looked from the outside like any Huron bark house, but within the black robes had made innovations which were the marvel of all their visitors. They divided the house into 3 apartments, separated by wooden doors such as the natives had never seen. The first room served as an antechamber and storm door to keep out the cold. The second was that in which they lived. It was at once kitchen, carpenter shop, place for grinding wheat, dining room, parlor, and bedroom. Beneath high wooden platforms on which they placed their chests of goods, the missionaries slept on sheets of bark or bed of boughs covered with rush mats. With skins and their clothing for covering, the third part was their little chapel where they set up their altar, pictures, and sacred vessels and celebrated Mass every day. The house itself attracted scores of visitors, but when the clock and the mill were set going, the astonishment of Indians knew no bounds. No guest came who did not beg to be allowed to turn the mill, and as for the clock, they sat in expectant silence by the hour, waiting for it to strike. They all thought it was some living thing. And when it began to strike, they would look about to make sure that all the black robes were there and that no one was hiding to shake it. They named it Captain of the Day and inquired for it as they would for a person, wishing to know what its food was and how many times it had spoken that day. The first time they heard it, they asked what it said, and the clever Jesuits told them 2 things. When he strikes 12 times, he says, "Come put on the kettle." This speech they remembered particularly well, for their own scanty meals were usually in the morning and evening, and they were very glad during the day to take a share of the Father's repast. But when he strikes 4 times, he says, "Go out, go away, that we may close the door." The Jesuits told their guests, and immediately they rose and went out, leaving the weary fathers free from the constant noise and chatter. The missionaries gathered the Indians for instruction on every possible occasion, teaching the children their prayers in Huron rhymes and preaching and explaining the faith to their elders. The converts, save those baptized on the point of death or in some fear of deadly peril, were few, but the worthy fathers persisted and won the gratitude of the people by their help in time of famine and their kindly ministrations for the sick. Other Jesuits joined them and founded additional missions in neighboring villages. The Indians never understood these mysterious white men, but regarded them with superstition, holding them answerable for bad weather, famine, and the like, and on the other hand honoring them when all was prosperous. The medicine men and sorcerers were constantly against them, and in 1637 Father Isaac Jogues, one of the leading Jesuits, heard the rumor that the white men were reported to have bewitched the nation and must therefore be cut off. The assembly of Huron chiefs met, and the Jesuit fathers addressed them as usual on their unfailing topic, the joys of heaven and the fires of hell, the latter being always the only part of the instruction that seemed to make any impression on the stolid audience. For the time being, the fathers escaped, but they were still in great peril. Brebeuf wrote a letter of farewell to his superior at Quebec, and no Jesuit left the house without the expectation of having a tomahawk crack into his head before he returned. The unflinching courage of the fathers won the Indian respect. The Jesuits even went so far as to give, according to the usual Indian custom for one on the point of death, a farewell feast to all the savages, an act which was regarded as a declaration that they knew their peril and faced it boldly. From that time forth, their supporters rose in defense of them. For the moment, the danger was averted, and the Jesuits walked abroad once more. From now on, however, their persecution as sorcerers continued at intervals in different places, rising now and then to a storm of superstitious frenzy. During the next 5 years, the Jesuits extended their mission among the Hurons till almost every town had resident priests. They established on the shores of the River Wye a central station which by 1648 had grown into a prosperous community with buildings which would accommodate 60 persons. Pioneers went out to neighboring nations. Brebeuf and a companion journeyed to the Neutral Nation, which lived north of Lake Erie and west and south of Lake Ontario, but were met with strong opposition stirred up by the superstitious Hurons, who conceived that it would be an easy and safe method of getting rid of the priests to have their neighbors kill them. The 2 escaped after great hardship and danger. Isaac Jogues and Charles Garnier went with attendants to the Tobacco Nation, which lived 2 days' journey distance to the southwest, but were as rudely repulsed. Jogues was a young man of indomitable will, to whom hard tasks seem always to have been assigned because of his complete self-surrender and consequent power. To him fell nevertheless, in the autumn of 1641, the pleasant duty of visiting a tribe in the far west who had invited the priests to come to them. At Lake Nipissing in September, the Jesuits met certain savages called Ojibways, who urged the Black Gowns to visit them in their homes and gave directions for the journey. In accordance with this invitation, Jogues and Rambolt, with a small Huron escort, set sail on Lake Huron, and after a voyage of 17 days, reached the rapids where dwelt their friends at the location of the modern Sault Ste. Marie. Here they found about 2,000 savages, who welcomed them cordially and looked and listened with awe as the priests celebrated Mass and explained their doctrines. They invited the Father to take up their abode with them, saying that they would embrace them like brothers and profit by their words, but the Jesuits could not be spared from their other work. Jogues listened with interest to tales of a great lake beyond the Soule which it took 9 days to cross, and of a great river beyond where dwelt mighty nations, who, the fathers reported to Paris, that have never known Europeans or heard of God. They could not stay, but sailed away, naming the place of their sojourn Ste. Marie. After the mission from which they came, they were not the first white men to visit this strait. Nicolet, a voyager and trader, had traveled with Brebeuf in 1634 as far as the Huron mission and had then pushed on alone to the foot of these rapids and thence along the shores of Lake Michigan, greeted everywhere by crowds of wandering savages. It was left, however, to these pioneer missionaries to give to this important waterway the name which it still bears. Jogues returned to the Huron mission and wintered there, starting in the spring of 1642 for Quebec with the Huron traders to bring supplies to the mission, which was in a state of destitution. As he was returning up the St. Lawrence River, he and his companion, Goupil, were captured by the Iroquois, who led them to the Mohawk towns. There, most of the Hurons of the party were killed, and Jogues and his white companion were tortured and terribly mutilated. Goupil lost his life in the Iroquois camp, but Jogues was finally rescued by Dutch allies of the Mohawk and sent to Europe. From there, he returned to New France and was tortured and killed by the Iroquois in 1646. Isaac Jogues was the first Jesuit to fall in the progress of that warfare, which was to bring to a tragic end that Jesuit mission to the Hurons by wiping out the towns in which the missionaries labored. The journey from Quebec to the Huron country was now fraught with peril from the marauding band of Iroquois warriors. 2 years after the first capture of Jogues, an expedition led by Brebeuf relieved the needs of the missionaries by bringing supplies. The same year, another Jesuit on his way to the mission was taken by the Iroquois, but in 1645 a temporary peace rekindled the hopes of the fathers. 3 years later, the warfare broke out with renewed fury, and it soon became evident that the Huron nation was doomed. Large bands of Hurons, deserting their towns, fled into the interior. The Jesuits aided those who remained to defend their homes. But town after town was taken, and one after another Jesuit fell into the hands of the Iroquois and suffered martyrdom with cruel tortures. The story of the tragic death of Jean Brebeuf, the founder of the mission, is one of the wonderful strength and endurance amid most revolting tortures. The few remaining Jesuits withdrew with the terrified Indian survivors to an island in Lake Huron, which they were able, for a time, to defend. But the Iroquois lay in an ambuscade and captured the fugitives whenever they went ashore. At the earnest entreaty of the chiefs of the doomed nation, the Jesuits gathered the remnants of their people and abandoned with them the desolate country which had been for 35 years the seat of missionary labors. Sadly, they proceeded on the long journey to Quebec, passing everywhere deserted villages which had been partially destroyed by fire. Once they were attacked by the Iroquois, but at length reached Quebec in safety. The Iroquois had driven the Hurons from their homes to perish by famine and pestilence until the whole nation was practically wiped out, and the most important field of Jesuit missions was turned into a solitude and a desolation. The future for French missions looked dark indeed, and for a time Western exploration was also abandoned. Within 4 years, hope of better success in converting the heathen appeared in an unexpected spot. The crafty Iroquois, attacked by their southern neighbors, sent overtures of peace to Quebec and invited to their village the once hated Jesuit priests. Father Le Moyne was the first to respond, and others followed, eager to convert their savage people. The first mission was brought to a speedy end by the uprising of the Iroquois against the remaining Hurons and their former white allies in 1658, but by 1665 the government of New France was strong enough to melt out deserved punishment to the marauding parties of Iroquois warriors, and by 1668 a mission was established in each of the 5 nations. Chapter 4: The Pageant of St. Lusson. In 1660, Father Menard passed through the Sault Ste. Marie and spent a winter ministering to the Indians on the southern shore of Lake Superior. In the following summer, he set out on an inland journey from the lake and was never heard from again. In the same year, however, 2 fur traders, Radisson and Groseilliers, coasted along the shore of Lake Superior and Lake Michigan and were followed by many Jesuit missionaries whose names had become famous. 2 principal mission stations were established, one on Sault Ste. Marie and the other at La Pointe, at the western end of Lake Superior. At these places, missionaries and traders heard many tales of a great river to the south, and of rich copper deposits in the lake region, which in turn led to more exploring expeditions. At Sault Ste. Marie in 1671, there were picturesque ceremonies where Domont and St. Lusson, agent of Louis XIV, took possession of the interior of North America in the name of his king. For months, the French and the Indians had been preparing for this pageant. Messages had been sent to all the Indian tribes living within 100 leagues of Sainte Marie, urging them to attend, and Nicolas Perrot, a Canadian voyager and interpreter, had visited many of the tribes in person to make sure of their coming. With a large Indian following, he paddled up the Strait of Mackinac from Lake Michigan and landed at the foot of the rapids. St. Lusson was already there with 15 men. The French leaders were housed at the mission station, while the savages made themselves comfortable in temporary lodges erected along the stretch of the shore and in the fields. Gradually, tribe after tribe from the north and the west arrived, and on the 14th of June, when 14 tribes or their representatives had come, St. Lusson announced that the ceremony would take place. The Frenchmen, led by St. Lusson, assembled in the village, and crowds of curious Indians gathered around the small group of white men. The French soldiers had brought out their gayest uniforms and had polished their swords and muskets till they shone in the sunlight. Coureurs de bois, runners of the woods, and other Indian traders stood about in their rough, picturesque costumes. At the head of the line walked 4 Jesuits, arrayed in the impressive vestments of the priesthood. The name of these 4 men stand today as they signed them at the foot of the instrument which records this act of taking possession. They were a group of priests noteworthy in the history of the lakes. At one end stood Father Claude de Blon, the superior of the missions of the lakes. Next to him, Gabriel Drulietz, a veteran missionary whose experience with the Indians exceeded probably that of any Frenchman in Canada, and who had been sent by the government years before on a mission to the English colonists on the Atlantic to invite their cooperation against the Iroquois. Father Claude Allouez had followed Father Menard in the Lake Superior country and founded the La Pointe mission, and Father Louis André was establishing a station among the Ottawas at Manitoulin Island. Father Allouez had been obliged to leave the young Jesuit missionary Marquette in charge at La Pointe. He had been with his brother priests, the circle of famous names would have been complete. Led by these 4 men, the line of Frenchmen, a motley company of soldiers, priests, explorers, and traders marched up the hill to a height which had been selected because it overlooked the surrounding country. On either side of the column and behind it hovered the vast throng of dusky Indians. As the Frenchmen halted and grouped themselves about a huge cross of wood that lay on the ground, the Indians fell into position behind them and stood silent, waiting to see what the white faces would do. When all was quiet, Father de Blon, as superior of the Lake Missions, stepped forward and blessed the cross with all the ceremonies of the church. At a sign from St. Lusson, the holy wood was lifted, and as the foot of the standard fell into the opening, preparing for it, the Frenchmen sang with all their hearts the ancient hymn of their church. The royal banners forward go, the cross shines forth in mystic glow. Fulfilled is all that David told, in true prophetic song of old, how God the heathen's king should be, for God is reigning from the tree. As they looked from the mighty cross to the horde of assembled savages, the Frenchmen felt that today, as never before, these words were fulfilled. The uncomprehending Indians, who gazed at the pageant with wondering delight in its pomp, knew how the minds of these white men were filled with the vision of a time of which this was the forerunner, when these red-skinned savages should be followers of the heavenly King of the French and the obedient retainers of their earthly monarch. Beside the cross was erected a cedar pole to which was nailed a metal plate engraved with the royal arms of France. As this was being raised, the Frenchmen chanted the 20th Psalm, "In the name of our God we will set up our banners." And one of the Jesuits even, "in that faraway corner of the earth," as the record says, offered a prayer for the French king in whose name all this was being done. Thus, side by side, the standards of the 2 monarchs were raised in the wilderness, and St. Lusson, stepping forward amid the expectant hush, with a sword in one hand and a sod of earth in the other, took formal possession of the soil with these words: "In the name of the most high and redoubtable sovereign, Louis XIV, Christian King of France and Navarre, I now take possession of all these lakes, straits, rivers, islands, and regions lying adjacent thereto, whether as yet visited by my subjects or unvisited, in all their length and breadth, stretching to the sea at the north and at the west, or on the opposite side extending to the South Sea. And I declare to all the people inhabiting this wide country that they now become vessels of his majesty, and bound to obey his laws and follow his customs. He will protect them against all enemies. In his name I declare to all other princes and sovereigns and potentates of whatever rank, and I warn their subjects that they are denied forever seizing upon or settling within the limits set by these seas, except it be the pleasure of his most Christian majesty, and of him who shall govern in his behalf, and this on pain of incurring his resentment and the efforts of his arms. Long live the king. As the last words fell from his lips, the Frenchman responded with a loud shout, Vive le roi, long live the king. Guns were fired, and the Indians shouted and yelped with delight. The astonishment and delight of those people, says the chronicler, knew no bounds, for they had never seen anything of the kind. If words and the planting of symbols could do it, the King of France had taken possession of the continent of North America, extending his dominion to the shores of seas of which he had no knowledge, but the dream of the French was not fulfilled. Today a rival people, which then occupied only a small strip of the Atlantic seaboard, has swept away almost every trace of the empire thus proclaimed. In order to impress upon the Indians more clearly the meaning of this august ceremony, Father Claude Allouez had been appointed to set forth the glory of the monarch to whom they were the day submitting themselves. He had spent many hours listening to flowery Indian harangues, and was familiar with the style of speech which suited their comprehension and met with their approval. What the Indians gathered from his curious address we do not know. After reading the part of it which has been preserved, we cannot wonder that, as the record tells, they had no words with which to express their thoughts. As soon as the wild uproar of shouts and musketry was hushed, Father Allouez stepped forward on a slight eminence and began his speech. With a few words he dismissed the usual subject of his priestly discourses, the cross and its significance, and turned to the other post on which, as he then explained to them, were fastened the immemorial bearings of the great captain of France. To him all the captains whom they had seen were mere children, or little herbs which one trampled underfoot as compared to a great tree. Even Onontio, the governor of New France, whose name was a daily terror to that mighty nation, the Iroquois, was but one of 10,000 captains who lived beyond the seas. When this great captain said, "I am going to war," all obeyed him. Those 10,000 captains raised companies of 100 warriors, each disposing them according to his order on sea or land. Those who were needed at sea embarked on great ships which held 400 or 500 or even 1,000 men, while their Indian canoes held only 4 or 5, or at best 10 or 12. Thus did this king with his vast numbers of followers prepare for war, and when he came to attacking the enemy, he was more terrible than thunder. And the earth trembled beneath him, while air and sea were set on fire by the discharge of his cannon. He had been seen in the midst of his warriors, covered with the blood of his enemies, whom he killed in such numbers that he set flowing rivers of blood. But all this was now long past. No one dared make war on him. All nations had submitted to him and begged humbly for peace. In this warlike guise, Father Allouez presented Louis XIV till the Indian admiration was fully aroused, and all were astonished to hear that there was any man on earth so great and rich and powerful. The day closed with a fine bonfire lighted toward evening, around which the Frenchmen sang the Te Deum, thanking God on behalf of those poor people who did not know enough to do it for themselves, that they were the subjects of so great and powerful a monarch. The Indians departed to their homes, traders and coureurs de bois disappeared into the forests, the Jesuits returned to their self-sacrificing life of ministry, and adventurous French pioneers set out across lake and wood to explore and claim the vast wilderness thus appropriated by France. The pageant of Saint Lusson was over, and Sault Ste. Marie relapsed into its usual life, but thus early in the history of the Great Lakes, this place had been singled out as a strategic spot. Chapter 5. The building of the Griffin. The next noteworthy event in the story of the Great Lakes is the building and the launching of the Griffin and the voyage of La Salle from the Niagara River to the southern end of Lake Michigan. Robert Cavalier, Sieur de La Salle, or La Salle, as he is usually called, came to Canada in 1666 when he was 3 or 4 and 30 years of age. Outwardly cold and reserved, he was inwardly consumed with a burning desire for adventure. After his arrival, he set to work to study the Indian languages, in which he soon became proficient, and it was his delight to invite Indians to his cabin and to draw for them tales of the far-off regions in which they dwelt, and especially of those wonderful rivers, the Ohio and the Mississippi, by the exploration of which he hoped to provide a new passage to China and Japan. An exploring trip which he took in 1669 gave him the practical experience which was later to be of value. La Salle was a man of strong prejudices and personal dislike, who took little pains to overcome the jealousy of those who were envious of him, but he gained one strong friend and patron, Count Frontenac, the governor of New France, who recognized a kindred spirit in this bold, enterprising young man. To a person of La Salle's disposition, the lands of the south of the Great Lakes offered alluring prospects of immediate gain. Instead of the barren soil, gloomy forests, and harsh climate of the lower St. Lawrence Valley, this new country was largely open and abundantly supplied with meadows, brooks, and rivers. The soil was so fertile that everything which could be produced in France could be easily raised, and there was an abundance of fish, game, and venison. Colonists would find it easy to supply their own needs and could engage in profitable cattle raising, for flocks and herds could be left out all winter. La Salle also reported that there was a species of native wild cattle called the buffalo, whose wool was better than that of any sheep in France. He sought Louis XIV, King of France, and asked permission to found colonies and to conduct the fur trade and explorations on the regions bordering on the Great Lakes. The French king did not wish to found new colonies, for those already in existence had proved very expensive, but he was willing that La Salle should labor at the discovery of the western parts of New France, provided that he pay all the expenses of the enterprise himself and bring the matter to a conclusion within 5 years. With this permission and such money as he could raise, La Salle returned to New France and in the autumn of 1678 set out to put his plans into execution. Detailed and interesting reports of his voyage on the waters of the Great Lakes have been preserved in the entertaining account of the journey which was written by Father Louis Hennepin, an adventurous missionary who delighted in telling stories about himself and his doing. He was also something of a prophet in foreseeing the time when there would be an inconceivable commerce on the Great Lakes and their shores would be lined with the shops and dwelling of the whites. Up to this time, the French missionaries and the fur traders had gained the interior by way of the Ottawa River or the Toronto and Georgian Bay. La Salle decided to buy a sailing vessel on the shore of Lake Erie in which he could transport his men to the stations he intended to establish, and also carry his trading goods to the Indians, and bring back the furs which he obtained in exchange for them. He already had a fortified post at Fort Frontenac on the northeastern shore of Lake Ontario. But he could not build his ship at this point because the natives told him that formidable cataracts interrupted the navigation between Lake Ontario and Erie. He sent an advanced company to establish a station at the head of Lake Ontario and to seek a convenient site on Lake Erie for the construction of the ship. With this expedition went Father Hennepin, whose graphic account of what he saw and of what he experienced is one of the most interesting in the annals of American exploration. The voyagers reached the mouth of the Niagara River in safety. When the current became too strong for them to go farther in their canoe, they landed and pushed forward through the snow. As they made their way along the edge of the river, they heard more and more clearly the roar of falling waters, and at length there burst upon their sight the Falls of Niagara, or the Thunder of Waters, as the Indian called it. That vast and prodigious cadence of water which falls down after a surprising and astonishing manner, insomuch that the universe does not afford its parallel, those of Italy and Switzerland being but sorry patterns. Hennepin describes this wonderful cataract as made up of 2 great cross-streams of water and 2 falls with an island between, and declares that when this prodigious quantity of water comes to fall, there is a din and a noise more deafening than the loudest thunder. The rebounds of the waters was so great that a cloud arose from the foam and hung over the abyss, even when the sun was at its height. He could not say enough of this most beautiful and at the same time most frightful cascade, which he saw for the first time on this December day in 1678. While Hennepin and his party were exploring the Niagara-la-Motte, the leader of the expedition had selected a site for a fortified house about 2 leagues above the mouth of the river and not far from the present town of Lewiston. He set his laborers to work, but their task was hard. Before the frozen ground had to be thawed with boiling water before it was possible to drive stakes for a palisade. As the carpenters labored at their tasks, distrustful and jealous Indians from the neighboring Seneca village of the Iroquois loitered about, watching them with sullen looks and intimidated in a way that could not be disregarded their unwillingness to allow the work to go on. And well they might. Niagara was the key to the 4 upper lakes from which the Iroquois fur trades could be controlled, and this fort was being built expressly to hold in check those vigorous tribes and put an end to their trade with the English and the Dutch in the furs which they obtained from the Indians of the West Territory. La Salle had realized that difficulty would probably arise, and had instructed La Motte to go to the great village of the Senecas and endeavor to gain their consent to the French plans for building the fort and the ship. This La Motte now decided to do. After 5 days' journey through the snowy forests, he and his companions reached the town which was beyond the Genesee and the southeast of Rochester, not far from the present town of Victor, New York. The weary travelers were conducted to the wigwam of the principal chief, where women and children flocked to gaze upon the whites. An old man, according to custom, went through the village announcing their arrival, and younger savages washed their feet and then rubbed them with bear's grease. The next afternoon, La Motte was summoned to confer with 42 old men who made up the Indian Council. These chiefs, clad in robes of beaver, wolf, or black squirrel, squatted upon the ground. But, writes Hennepin, the senators of Venice do not appear with a graver countenance and perhaps do not speak with more majesty and solitude than these ancient Iroquois. La Motte's interpreter harangued the assembly, stating that the French wished to build a great wooden canoe and to erect a fort on the banks of the Niagara River. He endeavored to convince the natives that this enterprise would be for their advantage, as it would enable the French to sell them goods at lower prices than the Dutch and English trades. He enforced every reason with wampum belts, and gifts of axes, knives, coats, and scarlet cloth. For the best arguments in the world were not listened to by the Indians unless accompanied by presents. The shrewd savage politicians received the gifts, but were not convinced. Their replies were general and evasive, and gave no satisfaction. When the council was over, they proceeded to torture an Indian prisoner, and La Motte, with his men, left the camp in disgust to go back and await the arrival of La Salle from Fort Frontenac. La Salle and Tonty, his ever-faithful friend and follower, with men and supplies for the expedition, arrived at the Seneca town not long after the departure of La Motte and his men. La Salle succeeded in so dexterously gaining their affection that the Indians consented to permit him to carry arms and ammunition by the Niagara portage, to build a vessel upon the cataract, and to establish a fortified warehouse at the mouth of the river. Armed with this permission, he proceeded to the encampment of La Motte. The rejoicing at this success was short-lived, for a few days later report came that a vessel which La Salle had left at the mouth of the Genesee River had been shipwrecked on the southern shore of Lake Ontario. Of all the equipment for his enterprise, with which this vessel was laden, only the anchors and cables for the new ship were saved. But La Salle, with his unvarying fortitude, went on with the work as if nothing had happened. La Salle selected a spot on the banks of the Niagara River above the falls at the mouth of what is now called Cayuga Creek, where the water was quiet, being sheltered by an island from the current of the river. A little village near that spot still bears his name. Hither the little company of 30 men, heavily laden with tools and provisions, journeyed laboriously through the snow on one of the last days of January 1679. 2 Mohegan hunters, who were with the party, set about making bark wigwams for the men and a chapel for Father Hennepin, who had traveled the 12 miles with his portable altar lashed to his back. The ship carpenters went to work at once, and in 4 days the keel of the vessel was ready. La Salle invited Father Hennepin to drive the first bolt, but the modesty of my religion profession, he says, compelled me to decline this honor, so La Salle himself drove the first nail in the ship. Fortunately, the majority of the Iroquois warriors had gone on the war path, but although those who had remained at home were less insolent because of the absence of the rest, yet they did not fail to visit the shipyard frequently, loitering sullenly about and exhibiting their displeasure. One of them, pretending to be drunk, attacked the blacksmith and tried to kill him, but the blacksmith vigorously defended himself with a red-hot bar of iron. This, together with the severity of the reprimand administered by Father Hennepin, who always represents himself as indispensable on every occasion, induced the savages to depart for the moment. The work went rapidly on, and the great wooden canoe began to show its proportions. The Indians became more and more alarmed. A few days later, a squaw told the French that they meant to burn the vessel on the stocks, and had not a very close watch been kept, they would undoubtedly have done so. These frequent alarms, the steady cold, and the shortage of supplies owing to the loss of La Salle's vessel and the enmity of the Iroquois who refused to sell them food, discouraged the shipbuilders. They would certainly have deserted had not La Salle and Hennepin taken great pains to reassure and cheer them on. Towards spring, La Salle set out on foot of Fort Frontenac to procure food and supplies and to attend to his personal affairs. His presence was needed there because his enemies had persuaded his creditors that the undertaking was a rash one, and had instigated them to seize all his goods, although Fort Frontenac alone was more than sufficient to pay his debts. During La Salle's absence from Niagara, one of the workmen endeavored to stir up the others to desert. "This bad man," announces Hennepin, "would infallibly have perverted our carpenters, had not I confirmed them to their good resolution by the exhortations I made them after divine service." The Mohegan hunters brought in deer and other game, warmer weather arrived, and cheerfulness once more prevailed. The shipbuilders went on with their work more briskly, and in the early spring of 1679, before La Salle returned, the vessel was ready to be launched. Father Hennepin blessed the ship and christened it the Griffin, for on the prow La Salle had placed a roughly carved figure of this mythical monster taken from the coat of arms of Count Frontenac. The assembled company sang a hymn of praise, 3 cannon were fired, and among loud acclamations from both French and Indians, the Griffin glided into the Niagara River. All haste had been made to get her afloat, even before she was entirely completed, to save her from the plots of the Indians, who were determined to burn her, but the men did not wait for her to be finished to put her to use. They immediately quitted their bark wigwams, swung their hammocks under her decks, and that very night, rejoicing in their security from the Indians, all slept soundly on board the ship. The Iroquois warriors, returning from a hunting trip, were mightily surprised to see the vessel afloat, and shouted, "Octkon, Octkon," which means most pertaining wits, to the triumph Frenchmen, for they could not understand how in so short a time the white man could build so large a canoe, although the craft was of only about 45 tons. With her 5 cannon, she was to the savages a wonderful moving fortress, and inspired them in a wholesome fear and admiration for the French. Chapter 6. La Salle on the Great Lakes. In the summer of 1679, La Salle returned from Fort Frontenac to Niagara to find the Griffin finished and ready for her first voyage. By the completion of this vessel, her enterprise was fairly launched. Behind him at Montreal were enemies and creditors. Before him stretched the waters of the Great Lakes, and beyond was the unexplored wilderness. The men had been unable to sail the Griffin up the Niagara River to the mouth of Lake Erie because of the strong adverse current. Now, with the help of a strong wind and with tow ropes in the most difficult places, La Salle brought the vessel through the turbulent water to the calm outlet of the lake. There, the crew celebrated their safe passage with religious services and cannonading, and then set sail on the unknown waters. To deter his men from the voyage, La Salle's enemies had declared that the lake was full of rocks and sand. For the first day and night, therefore, the men kept their sounding lines busy, but navigation proved to be easy. On the 4th day after leaving Niagara, they reached the mouth of that wide river called by the French the Strait, Detroit. Here the current was so strong that they came to anchor to wait for a favorable breeze. Soon a brisk wind arose, and the Griffin plowed her way through the rapids between Grosse Isle and the mainland, pioneer of the mighty vessel which today make that strait one of the great commercial highways of the world. On both sides stretched fine open fields dotted with fruit and walnut and chestnut groves, and beyond in the distance were lofty forests. All were so well disposed, says Hennepin, that one would think nature alone, without the help of art, could not have made so charming a prospect. Flocks of turkeys and swans circled about, and from the deck of the ship herds of deer could be seen roaming the meadows. The Griffin was soon well stocked with meat, and the returning hunters united in heaping praises on this beautiful spot where fruit and game of every kind abounded, and wherever the bears were not so savage as in other places. Hennepin urged La Salle to make a settlement on this charming strait, but La Salle coldly reminded him of the great passion which he had professed a few months before for the discovery of a new country, and the priest was silent. Amid the later hardships of the journey, all must have looked longingly back to this time of ease and plenty at the Strait of Detroit. On the 12th of August, the Griffin passed by the site of the present city of Detroit. Had they come here 10 years before, the explorers would have found on the bank of the river a large stone, rudely fashioned in the likeness of a human figure, and bedaubled with paint, which the Indians worshipped as a Mateo, or god. But in 1670, French priests, making the first recorded passage through the strait, had come upon the image, and full of hatred for this false deity, had fallen upon it with their axes, breaking it in pieces and casting it into the water. Beyond Detroit, the river widened into a beautiful little sheet of water, and it was St. Clair's Day, Hennepin's proposal, that the name of the founder of his order be given to this lake was carried out, and it received its present name. When the Griffin had crossed the lake, the men saw before them wide marshes through which the swift-moving river had many a widening channel. They had come to the St. Clair Flats, a fan-shaped delta of 7 channels on which has been built today a popular summer resort. They set to work sounding one passage after another, only to find them shallow and almost barred with shoals. But at last they came upon an excellent channel about a league broad, with no sands and a depth everywhere of from 3 to 8 fathoms of water, through which the vessels sailed easily toward Lake Huron. At the mouth of the river, however, they were forced to drop anchor and remain for several days. A north wind had been blowing, driving the water of the 3 upper layers into the strait. This had increased so much of the usual force of the current that it was as violent as that of the Niagara and entirely impassable for a vessel like the Griffin. Even when the wind turned southerly, La Salle could make no headway against this current until he sent ashore a dozen men who hauled and towed the vessel along the beach for half an hour, dragging her out of the narrow mouth of the channel into the wave-tossed waters of the lake. Once more all returned, thanks to the Almighty of their happy navigation, and set sail on the 23rd of August on Lake Huron. The favoring winds soon died down, and La Salle became for 2 days among the islands of Thunder Bay. Starting from there at noon on his way northward, he was caught in a furious westerly gale. For hours the little vessel tossed and drifted over the raging waters of the lake, lying at the mercy of wind and wave. Even La Salle gave up hope and told his men to prepare for death. All fell on their knees except the pilot, who devoted the time instead to cursing and swearing against his employer for having brought him there to perish in a nasty lake and lose the glory he had acquired by long and happy navigations on the ocean. But Pilot Lucas and his brave commander were not destined to perish in that storm. Hennepin vowed an altar to St. Anthony of Padua, prudently agreeing to set it up in Louisiana if they should reach there. The storm clouds rolled away, the waters grew quiet, and the sun shone out on the wood cliffs of the islands of Bois Blanc and Mackinac, and the dense forests of Michigan. The vessel anchored behind the point of St. Ignace in the harbor of Mackinac, the settlement which was at once the center of Jesuit missions and of Indian trades. The sound of the Griffin's cannon brought out a varied throng from the wigwams and cabins on shore. Shouting Indians gazed with wonder at this huge wooden canoe, lawless French traders, swarthy from long years in the wilderness, to whom the distance of this trading post from civilization was its strongest recommendation, lounged idly out of their cabins, gazing with resentment at this invader of their trade and country. while black-robed Jesuit priests hurried to the shore to welcome the newcomers. Indians, traders, and Jesuits united in a show of welcome to La Salle as he landed, finely dressed and wearing a scarlet cloak bordered with broad gold lace. All marched to the little bark chapel in the Ottawa village and united with the voyageurs in hearing Mass and giving thanks for their safe passage. At this settlement, La Salle found 4 of 15 men whom he had sent ahead the autumn before to buy furs and to go to the tribes along the Illinois River, making preparations for his coming. Most of these men had been enticed from his service and had wasted the goods given them to exchange for furs, using them for their own personal gain. Troubled over his affairs in Canada, La Salle had meant to return from this point to Montreal, leaving Tonty to conduct his party to the Illinois River. But he soon felt the hostile spirit at the trading post and realized that his presence was necessary to keep his men from being drawn away. Even the swarms of Indians who hovered in their canoes about the vessel regarded it with wonder and jealousy rather than friendliness, and La Salle feared that the Illinois tribes would be tampered with by his enemies. He determined to push on at once and embarked early in September. The vessel proceeded across Lake Michigan, called by the French and Indians Lake Illinois, from the name of the tribes who inhabited its southern shores, and cast anchor at the entrance of Green Bay. Here, matters took a turn for the better. As the vessel lay tossing about behind a point of the bay, an Indian chief came out of his canoe to greet the Frenchmen. When he learned that La Salle was a friend of Count Frontenac and bore his commission, the Indian told him of his own warm friendship with Frontenac, for whom he would gladly lay down his life and welcome La Salle with the greatest cordiality. He reported to the presence of Frenchmen nearby, and La Salle found the faithful remnant of his advance party waiting with a cargo of furs which they had collected. Eager to satisfy his clamorous creditors, he determined to send back the Griffin, in charge of the pilot and 5 men with this load of furs. On the 18th of September, the Griffin fired a parting shot and started for Niagara to return as soon as she had discarded her cargo, and La Salle, with Hennepin and 14 others, embarked in 4 canoes for the south. The canoes had hardly started when a sudden September storm swept across the lake. The waves washed into the heavily laden canoes, darkness fell, and it was only by constant shouting that the men kept their boats together and got to shore. For 4 days the storm raged with unabated fury. As La Salle and his men waited from day to day in their cheerless encampment, living on pumpkins and Indian corn presented them by the friendly Indian chief and the meat of a single porcupine brought in by a hunter, the thought of the Griffin haunted them. Their worst fears proved afterwards to have been fulfilled. She was never heard of again. With her sank the cargo which was to have restored La Salle's credit in Montreal, and with her too perished the high hopes that had been set upon their first vessel on the upper lakes. Although La Salle feared the worst, he did not turn back. As soon as the lake grew calm, the 4 canoes set out again, coasting southward along the shore of Wisconsin. But the elements were against them. Storm after storm drove them ashore, where they spent wretched days and nights among the rocks and bushes, crouched around driftwood fires, with nothing to shelter them from snow and rain but their blankets. As they went southward, steep, high bluffs ran so close to the lake that it was hard to find a landing place. Yet the violence of the wind was so great that they were compelled at evening to drag their canoes to the top of the bluffs in order not to leave them exposed all night to the waves which would have dashed them to pieces. In the morning, in order to re-embark, 2 men had to go into the water to the waist and hold a canoe upright until it was loaded, pushing it out or drawing it back as the waves advanced or retreated. Food gave out, and the men paddled from morning till night with nothing to eat but a daily handful of Indian corn and hawthorn berries, which they picked on shore and devoured so ravenously that they made them ill. Exhaustion and famine stared them in the face, but relief was in sight. One morning, as the men were paddling along near the site of Milwaukee, they saw upon the shore a cloud of ravens and eagles hovering over something. They hastened on land and found the body of a deer which had been killed by a wolf. This was the beginning of better things. As the little fleet advanced towards the south, they found the country ever fairer and the weather more temperate. There was an abundance of game, of which they had hitherto been an exceptional lack. They passed the Chicago River and circled at the end of the lake, landing at the mouth of the St. Joseph. Here, La Salle waited for Tonty to join them. Employing the time in building a fort, on the 3rd of December, the party sailed up the river, bound for the villages of Illinois. On a later trip in 1682, La Salle reached the Illinois settlements by a shorter route, crossing from his fort to the River Chicago and journeying from its waters into a northern branch of the Illinois River. In 4 months, La Salle had traversed the length of Lake Erie, had passed through the Strait of Detroit, up Lake Huron, through the Straits of Mackinac, and down Lake Michigan. From the sites of Buffalo and Cleveland, he had sailed past Detroit and Milwaukee, even to Chicago, and had then journeyed inland to the Illinois River. He had lost his vessel and her crew, as well as all his furs. He had met with hostility from French and Indian alike. He had been deserted by most of his advance party, and he had held his own crew only by his presence and the dominating force of his personality. He had suffered endless hardships and privations, but nothing had shaken his purpose. In later years, he followed the Illinois and the Mississippi to the Gulf of Mexico and led a colony to the limits of the present state of Texas, where he was murdered by one of his men. In history, La Salle stands out as a man whose courage and persevering fortitude in the face of almost insuperable obstacles mark him as one of the greatest explorers the world has ever known. We do well to join with Hennepin in saying those who shall be so happy as to inhabit that noble country cannot but remember with gratitude those who discovered the way by venturing to sail upon unknown lands. Chapter 7. A hapless French governor. Like all strong men, Frontenac made many enemies. He was recalled in 1682, and General Le Barre, a man of about 60, was sent out in his place. Le Barre had made a good record in the West Indies, but was entirely unable to handle the difficult problems which met him in New France. In an evil hour for the French, the Iroquois had conquered the southern neighbors with whom they had long waged wars that had occupied most of their time and strength. Now they were free to turn on the Indian allies of Canada, of whose commercial gains through the fur trade with the French they had long been envious. Frontenac, before his departure, had found the Iroquois unusually arrogant and unruly, although they had come to regard him as the greatest of all Onontiots, as they named the governors of New France. The Dutch and the English had meanwhile made more or less successful advances to the Iroquois, who now fully realized their own importance from the efforts of both French and English to gain their support. For 2 years, Le Barre struggled on, entangling rather than helping the situation. At length, an Iroquois chief was murdered in a village of French Indians, and the crisis came. In the early spring of 1684, French canoes were plundered by the Senecas, and Le Barre felt that he must assert his power or the Indians would lose their respect for the French. After making great preparations, he started with his soldiers in frontiersmen for the Seneca country by the way of the St. Lawrence to Fort Frontenac, and thence across Lake Ontario. The opposing current of the river was so strong that frequently the men could make no progress by paddling, but were obliged to tow the canoes or push them along with poles. Every few miles were rapids around which the canoes were transported and through which the flatboats were pulled with the greatest effort. The mosquitoes were insufferably troublesome, hovering over the men in such clouds that they could hardly see their way, so one of the soldiers wrote, "At Fort Frontenac, the men fell ill of a malarial fever, which killed many and disabled more." Le Barre repented more than once of entering upon an expedition that he now saw would be disastrous. Whatever his former warlike purposes, Le Barre was now eager for peace. He sent Le Moyne, a veteran interpreter, whom the Iroquois called the Partridge, to the Onondagas to ask them to meet him on the southern side of the lake, 20 miles or so north of Oswego. Le Moyne returned in a few days with the famous Onondaga chief, Big Mouth, in French. This is Le Grand Gueulet, which the soldiers shortened to Grangula. Big Mouth had recently been conferring with the English, whose arbitrary demands had offended his pride. He was now in a haughty mood that boded ill for the French. The Indian chief was accompanied by a train of 30 young warriors. As soon as he disembarked, General Le Barre sent him a present of bread and wine and 30 salmon trouts. At the same time, he gave him to understand that he was pleased at his arrival and would be glad to have an interview with him after he had rested himself. To conceal from Big Mouth the weakness of the French forces, Le Moyne represented to him that the most of the soldiers had been left behind at Fort Frontenac, and that the troops which he saw were the general's guards. But one of the Iroquois knew a little of the French tongue. Strolling noiselessly about the tents by night, he overheard the talk of the soldiers and learned the true state of affairs. It was 2 days after his arrival before Big Mouth gave notice to Le Barre that he was ready for an interview. The council was held on an open spot between the two encampments. From the picture drawn by one of the French soldiers, we see the arrangement. Le Barre was seated in state in an armchair with his Jesuit interpreter beside him, and the French officers ranged on his right and left. The 2 lines of French soldiers formed 2 more sides of the square. Opposite Le Barre sat the Indians with Big Mouth and their spokesman in front, and between them in the center of the square was placed the great calumet, or pipe of peace. The stem of this huge pipe was about 4 feet long, and the body or bowl about 8 inches high. The bowl was of handsome red stone, well polished, and the stem of a strong reed or cane, trimmed with yellow, white, and green feathers. In shape it resembled a huge hammer more than anything else. The Indians used these calumets for negotiations as we use a flag of truce, holding them peculiarly sacred. To violate the rights of this venerable pipe was regarded among them as a flaming crime that would draw down mischief upon their nations. About this calumet was piled the wampum belts to be presented by the speakers. Le Barre opened the council, speaking boldly and with apparent assurance. He made no allusion to his original purpose of making war on the Senecas, but announced that the king, his master, had sent him there with a guard to meet the principal chiefs of the 5 nations at an appointed council fire. The 5 nations had made infractions upon the peace concluded between them and the French. Should Big Mouth be willing, as their representative, to make reparations and offer promises for the future, the great French monarch desired that Le Barre and Big Mouth should smoke together in calumet of peace. Le Barre recounted the 3 offenses of the Iroquois. They had robbed and ill-used French trades. For this he demanded reparation. They had brought the English to the lakes, which belonged to the French, thus diverting trade from the latter. This he would forget, provided it did not happen again. They had attacked the Illinois, and still held many in captivity. "These people are my master's children," said Le Barre. "It must therefore cease to be your slaves. They must be sent home at once." He enforced each statement with a wampum belt, and ended every request with an announcement, as bold as though he had the whole French army at his back, that should these demands not be complied with, he had express orders to declare war. Even going so far once as to say, in case of your refusal, war is positively proclaimed. He would gladly leave them in peace should they prove religious observers of the treaties. But if not, he added, concluding with a statement which he knew to be false, he would oblige to join the governor of New York, who had orders from his king to assist Le Barre in burning the 5 villages and cutting off the Iroquois. While Le Barre's interpreter translated this speech, Grangula sat silent and attentive, gazing steadily at the bowl of his pipe. After the harangue was finished, he rose and walked round inside the square made by the French and savages 5 or 6 times. Then he returned to his place, and drawing himself to his full height, began to speak. "Onontio, I honor you," he said, "and all the warriors that accompany me do the same. Your interpreter has made an end of his discourse, and now I come to begin mine. My voice glides to your ear, pray listen to my words." He thought that the French captain must have started out from Quebec with some strange idea that the 5 nations had been wiped out by fire or flood. Nothing else, he implied, could make him set out against so powerful a federation with such an army. The Indian chief, ironically, assured the French general of the continued prosperity of the 5 nations, congratulating him that he brought the calumet of peace, rather than the bloody axe that had been so often dyed with the blood of the French. Then he spoke out boldly and directly, telling Le Barre that he knew better than to believe the Frenchman's pretense, that he did not have any other purpose in approaching the lake than to smoke the pipe of peace with the Onondagas. He saw plainly that the Ononito meant to knock them on the head, if French arms had not been so much weakened. The French soldiers were to be congratulated that the Great Spirit had visited them with sickness, for only thus had their lives been saved from Indian massacre. Even the women and old men and children would have attacked the French camp without fear. Had he not, Ekusein, Lemoyne, appeared at the Onondaga village announcing that he was an ambassador of peace, not of war. With this bold and telling introduction in which he revealed to the French his full comprehension of their weakness and of their deceit, Big Mouth proceeded to consider the accusation of Le Barre. The pillage of French traders he justified on the ground that they were carrying arms to the Illinois, and for this he flatly refused to give satisfaction, declaring insultingly that even the old men of his tribe had long ceased to fear the French. They had conducted the English to the lakes to traffic with French allies, just as the Algonquins conducted the French to the Five Nations to trade with them. Moreover, he claimed that they had a perfect right to do as they pleased in this matter. "We are born free men," he declared proudly, "and have no dependence either upon the Onondaga, governor of Canada, or the Coroller, governor of New York. We have power to go where we please, to conduct whoever we will to the places we resort to, and to buy and sell where we think fit. If the French chose, they might make slaves of their allies, robbing them of the liberty of entertaining any other Indians, but the Five Nations would brook no such interference. The Iroquois attacked the Illinois because they invaded their territory, hunting beavers on their land. Big Mouth met the reproof of Le Barre with a bold stroke in return. He declared that in defending their own lands against the Illinois, they had done less than the English and French, who without any right had usurped the grounds they now possessed, dislodging from them several nations in order to make way for the buildings of their cities, villages, and forts. Big Mouth closed his address with a warning. A year ago, the hatchet had been buried in the presence of Count Frontenac at his fort, and the tree of peace had been planted. It was then stipulated that this fort should be used as a place of retreat for traders and not a refuge for soldiers. Big Mouth warned the French to take care lest so great a number of soldiers as he now saw before him stifle and choke the tree of peace, and hinder it from shading both countries with its leaves. The Iroquois were ready to dance under its branches, the dance of peace, and never dig up the hatchet to cut it down, unless the governors of Canada and New York, jointly or separately, should invade the country given by the Great Spirit to their ancestors. The Indian orator presented 2 wampum belts and sat down. As soon as he had done, Le Moyne and the Jesuits interpreted his answer to Le Barre, who thereupon retired to his tent and stormed and blustered till someone came and represented to him that good manners were not to be expected from an Iroquois. It was little wonder that Le Barre raged. The Indian chief had seen through his artifice, had yielded to none of his demands, and had contrived to assert the complete independence of his own tribes and their contempt for the French. Big Mouth entertained some of the French officers at a feast, which he opened for them by dancing an Indian dance. There was another council in the afternoon, and the terms of peace were settled upon in the evening. These terms were in the usual form of Indian treaties. A word of the Iroquois was answered by a word of the French accepting it, and all disputed points were taken up in a series of such words. The Iroquois offered to the French a beverage devoid of bitterness to purify whatever inconvenience they had expected on their voyage, and to dispel whatever bad air they had breathed between Montreal and this council fire, a beverage of which the malarial French were certainly in dire need. They reminded the French of the deep ditch dug the year before, into which all unkind things that might occur were to be cast, and requested the French to throw into it the Seneca robbery, to which the French agreed. Again, the tree of peace was set up, each side solemnly adjuring the other to sustain and strengthen it. The French agreed to depart at once, and then, and not till then, did the Iroquois consent to renew the former treaty, dispelling all the clouds that had obscured the sun from their sight. Thus ended the grand expedition of Le Barre. No real satisfaction had been gained by the French, but a weak truce had been made, and the Iroquois had taken the opportunity to assert boldly their independence of French and English alike, whom they treated as invaders of their rightful possessions. Big Mouth and his men returned to their homes, and the French set out for Montreal. The few healthy men that remained manned the general's canoes and took charge of the flat-bottomed boats in which the soldiers were carried. Of the dangers attendant on shooting the rapids in these boats, one of the soldiers draws a vivid picture, declaring that he and his companions wished themselves back in the canoes that had brought them up. When they shot down, such precipice of water as had never been heard of before. The main current wound its way in and out past eddies and rocks, dashing along as fast as a cannonball, and the men steered as well as they could along this zigzag course, knowing that a false stroke of the oar would send them upon the rocks. But in spite of the discomfort and danger, this soldier confesses from the safe shelter of Montreal that though the risk was very great, yet by way of compensation one had the satisfaction of running a great way in a very short time. And he closes with a word of sympathy for Labarre. All the world blames our general for his bad success. The people here are busy in wafting to court 1,000 calumnies against him, but after all the poor man could do no more than he did.